Good evening, everyone. We are working our way through In Divine Friendship by Swami Kriyananda. We're actually notably advanced in the book now. Often on Tuesdays we've had the pleasure of Keshava's chanting, but alas, he has other assignments right now, so we're not going to see him for a few weeks here. I'm sorry too. Okay, let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dear friend Swami Kriyananda, inspire us with a more intuitive understanding of the intention behind your words and the consciousness behind your intention, that we may receive through these letters your wisdom, your joy, your profound love for God. Lift our hearts, that we may walk through this world in constant remembrance of our oneness with the divine. Om. Peace. Amen. So, this book is too hard for me to see without the magnifier. We are in the section of this book called Yoga and Christianity, and we are actually literally right in the middle of a letter. And there are 3 letters. This is I'm not quite sure why they put these in the order that they did. These are 3 letters from 1998. They're all conversations Swami was having with the same person. I'm pretty sure I probably said this last time, but it was 2 weeks since I've recorded. This man was an Episcopal priest. He had a very strong connection, of course, to the teachings of Jesus, and he was a little biased in favor of what he'd learned in seminary. And there's 3 letters, April 6th, April 5th, and April 8th. I think they make more sense if they had been put in chronological order, but they aren't. So the April 6th letter, which is we're in the middle of reading right now, it starts out by Swami saying, everything I read about the life and teachings of Jesus, it looks like I can read it without the magnifying glass. I don't know if that means my eyes are getting worse or better, but anyway, it's happening. Everything I read about the life and teachings of Jesus shows him to have been a complete sannyasi, a renunciate, and to have taught the way of sannyas. This is relevant because the argument or the assertion that Swami's correspondent was making here was that Jesus embraced and endorsed the world as it is. And this is kind of the discussion back and forth. Whereas in the, what you might call the Eastern way of looking at things, you have to renounce this world, transcend it in order to find the kingdom of heaven. So he's asserting, the correspondent with Swami is asserting that Jesus was a man of the people and that he embraced the world. And Swami answers, everything I read about the life and teachings of Jesus shows that he was a sannyasi. And so we've been through half of Swami's answer to this man's letter, in which he was trying to assert that creation is good and that Jesus endorsed it. The letter that's out of sequence is actually on April 5th. Swami wrote to him, it would help me to be able to point to some specific teaching of Jesus where he himself, and not St. Paul, speaks of embracing the world in any sense. That was the first thing that Swami wrote to this man. Why don't you support what you're saying about Jesus with something from the Bible? And then Swami wrote on the 6th, conceivably not hearing from the man. This is, of course, the age of email, so conversation can be instant. But apparently Swami hadn't heard an answer because he finishes the sentence, everything I read says that he's a sannyasi. And then we have a third one, but I'll get there. So now we're in the middle of the letter, where the correspondent has said that Jesus embraced the world and affirmed God's creation. And Swami says, I think he was a sannyasi, and I think he transcended this world. So we're right in the middle of that paragraph here. I'll read one paragraph above that I already commented on just to orient us. Man is sinful, but man is also the crowning achievement of creation, and a wonderful achievement for all his stumbling, sinning, and struggling. It is his final end in God that is wonderful, not his ignorant fumbling while he voyages. Yes, of course, truth is life-affirming, but life with a capital L. So Swami is saying that what makes man exquisite in the eyes of truth and of the divine is the potential we have within us for God realization. It's not the fact that we spend so much time doing other things before we get there. And that's sort of the discussion that Swami's having. So now we go on with the next part. Does God really reveal himself through our fears, etc., as you say? To this extent only, that through our fogs of delusion, there is still the light of truth. But I do not accept that human suffering is itself a revelation of God's presence. It is only a revelation of our need and perhaps of our conscious longing for him. The dilemma that Swami's trying to sort of answer here is something that I have encountered on the unusual occasions when I have actually been present in a traditional Christian church, including the church of this man that Swami's having this conversation with. But no, on those occasions, it was usually I who gave the sermon. I remember, for example, that it happens to be a Mormon church. And because the Mormons have done so much missionary work around the world, every year they have a display of creche scenes that their members have gathered from all of their missionary work all over the planet. And then you have these exquisite creche scenes that reflect the culture from which they came. You have an African version in which the animals that visit the baby Jesus are lions and giraffes. You have the Eskimo version in which the baby is wrapped in a fur parka and he's visited by seals and polar bears. You know, it's just like everybody puts it in their own context, and the materials from which they're made are often from wherever they are. And every year, I love to go and see that display. It's beautiful, it's entertaining, it's heart-opening. And as part of the display, they sometimes have a program. They have a program of music, they'll have some readings, they'll have a sermon or something like that, and you can kind of go in and out. You don't just have to sit in the church service. That was the most recent one that I was exposed to, and it's not particular to Mormonism, it was just what it was. And there is this tremendous effort to try to give divine meaning to ordinary human events. And just because we want to. We want to be able to claim that God's presence is behind everything we do, and it is. But it's not a sentiment. It's a divine experience that it's possible to have because God is always equally present in everything. But so often what happens is it just becomes a sentiment. And we sort of try to talk about how, well, like this man did, how good creation is and how loving our God is to us. But the fact of the matter is, if we're not really actually in tune and experiencing God's presence, life can be exceedingly difficult. So the explanation is, well, we try to make everything beautiful, even the suffering, even the fear. It's true, because if you can actually be conscious of God in the midst of everything, you realize that He's equally present everywhere. but too often it's just an affirmation. And that's what I felt when I was sitting in that church. They were trying very hard, and I respected them for trying, but the actual experience, the transcendent experience, was lacking. I felt the same thing when I went with my father to the Yom Kippur services in the Reformed temple that he attended. And in that case, it was, the prayer book was full of marvelous teachings, but I don't think the rabbi understood them. So I had to fight on that particular occasion an urge which I knew would not be welcome. I wanted to go to the rabbi and ask him to give me the mic for about 15 minutes because I felt there was so much more that could be said. But the rabbi was not trained as I was trained to know it. But we still feel somewhere that God is present, and it's a very challenging way of life until we understand what self-realization is, understand Satchidananda. I mean, the relief when I found the teachings of Master, because it just makes so much sense. And I have a very inquiring mind, and I've never met a question that Master's teachings, especially through Swamiji, I didn't have a really good answer for. And I don't just mean a sentimental answer where we hope that it means something. I mean a really good answer. Reincarnation, karma, the manifestation of God through an expression of Satchidananda, the potential of God realization within us, the practice of Kriya, the nature of Kundalini. Every dilemma and every unfulfillment that we experience in life can be resolved. And at least speaking for myself, well, I would be dead in a ditch somewhere else if it wasn't for the discovery of these teachings. People ask me sometimes, what did Swamiji do for you? Well, otherwise I would be dead in a ditch. That's how I feel. Literally saved my life. I also like human suffering isn't, I do not accept that human suffering is in itself a revelation of God's presence, which I'm sure the correspondent was trying to find some way that our suffering is an expression of God. Without the whole picture of Sanatana Dharma, it's hard to make sense. It is only a revelation of our need, and perhaps of our conscious longing for Him. I've often thought about that, you see. We're suffering, and therefore we need an answer. That's what Swami says. It proves the presence of God in the sense that it reveals our need to be rescued from the confusion of a human-only perspective on life. And also of our conscious longing for Him, and this is the way I think about it. If we didn't know that bliss was our true nature, we wouldn't even have a word for suffering. You see, because there has to be a contrast. Suffering feels like an aberration to us, and yet suffering is so common in the world among sentient creatures everywhere. Why do we know? How do we know that it shouldn't happen? But somehow we do, don't we? And we rebel against it because we know deep in our souls that our true nature is something else, and there's something wrong here. Suffering itself tells me that there's something wrong because I know who I'm supposed to be. And in that sense, yes, it does reveal the presence of God by our rebellion against it, against suffering. Another thing, Swami writes, I cannot and do not accept is that any truth can be uniquely a biblical view. Truth is truth. Great masters of all religions have realized it, regardless of any inherited, or perhaps I should say imbued, religious tradition. It is to them we should look for guidance on these matters, not to scholars, thinkers, and theologians. This is a theme that Swami carried out much more in the book Revelations of Christ. Revelations of Christ is not a repetition of Master's commentary on the New Testament. When Swami wrote the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, he goes verse by verse through the whole Bhagavad Gita, and each verse he interprets as he remembers Master interpreting it. Swami sat with Master when he wrote his interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita. He was with Master helping to edit his manuscript. So Swami knows that book really well, and when he sat down to write that, he said he had a superconscious memory of Master's voice dictating that book and the words that were on the page. So he goes verse by verse and explains what each verse of the Gita means from Master's perspective. Master also wrote a lot of direct commentary on verses in the New Testament, but he never asked Swami to work on that book or to write that book with him as he did the Gita. So Swami never felt responsible for the editing of that book as he did with the Gita book. So SRF put out a version of Master's New Testament commentary. Swami wrote the book, The Revelations of Christ, which of course interprets a great deal of the New Testament. But the Revelations of Christ is not a verse-by-verse commentary by any means. I mean, just simply not at all. Revelations of Christ is an explanation about why the only people who are qualified to explain what Jesus intended is those who share his consciousness. And Swami, in fact, talks about the fact that increasingly the Bible, the definition of what Jesus taught in the Bible has been, the authority for that has been given to scholars, sometimes politicians, academics, theologians, novelists, movie makers. And he said just true believers are getting, those who want to believe in Jesus, are getting completely confused. And Swami said it's just no theologian, he can just think about it, but he can't share the revelation. So Swami argues emphatically that those who have the right to interpret it have to share his consciousness, which is to say the saints. We must always look to the saints, not to mere intellectuals, to find out what any scripture means, but especially the Bible. So he says, all masters have the same truth, and it's almost in itself, it betrays the teachings of Jesus to say that his teachings were unique. Jesus never made such a claim. He said he was there to fulfill the ancient scripture. He was not there to contradict them. He just was coming to show, like avatars do. See, this is the problem that the Christian teaching has, because they do not have a tradition of avatars. In India, there's a tradition of avatars. We understand that they come whenever virtue declines and vice gets in the ascendant. I, the infinite spirit, take human visible form to push back the darkness and increase the light. So the fact that masters of the same state of consciousness return again and again is just in the fabric. It's in the understanding of Sanatana Dharma. Because scholars and theologians and church institutions declare Jesus to be the only Son of God and think that Jesus meant the body that he was living in, not the consciousness he had achieved. If Jesus was the only one ever, and as some theologians put it, revelation and salvation began and ended with Jesus Christ. They're just sort of stuck. They don't know what to do. So they have to make him unique. They think they're showing him greater reverence by making him unique. They don't understand it actually, in the eyes of those who understand Sanatana Dharma, it diminishes him. to have people claim in his name that he's the only one who ever had an infinite perception, but that's a lot to go through. But Master said, and this was Master's mission, to restore the original teachings of Jesus and the original teachings of Krishna and show that they are the same truth. His specific mission was to show that Jesus was part of a tradition rather than just one entity. And of course, in our times, when we have such a broad vision of time and space and history and planets and so on, it doesn't make any sense that God waited until this one person was born, poured out everything he had to pour out, and then that's that. It's just, there's no reason to it. So that's why Master came, because the teachings of Jesus are profound and thrilling, but they're not more thrilling for standing alone. They're more thrilling for being part of this great cosmic wave of enlightenment. And that's the true revelation of Christ. The Revelation of Christ book of Swami is very fun to read. It's more of an intuitive flow than some of his other books. You just sort of enter into this, and it communicates as much through vibration as through intellectual concept. It's a great joy to read. There's also an audio book of Swami himself reading it, which is a very dynamic way to enjoy it also. God does work through history. Again, Swami's answering his correspondent. God does work through history, but I don't really know why Christian writers have made such a big thing of that. It suggests their focus is outward and not on the kingdom of God within ourselves. Superficial, in other words. Swami just says it like it is, isn't it? You know, there's this thread where they have to show God's hand. He said, of course he does. Although for all that, it's still valid. The masters themselves take an interest in world events and guide them as they can within the karmic limitations people themselves impose. In Autobiography of a Yogi, one of the most really comforting paragraphs in that book is when Master says, Jesus and Babaji are concerned about the direction of civilization with its racial bigotry, its religious sectarianism, its excessive materialism. They're concerned about it. But they have also planned the salvation of this age, which is through the practice of direct attunement with the divine, which is what the Kriya Yoga technique is about. What the Kriya Yoga technique does, it says to every human being, you, with a little bit of concentrated effort on your part, can have a direct relationship with the infinite spirit. You do not need any institution. You don't need any particular external ritual. You don't have to give anybody any money. You don't have to please any authority. And this is how Master put it: the only place that God can be experienced is in the human nervous system, which I've always just loved the juxtaposition of those words, that the salvation of this age is a change of consciousness, a direct change of consciousness. So Master brought, through Babaji and Jesus, this opportunity to directly change our consciousness. The first time I traveled outside the Western countries of the world, I went to India in the late 80s, 1986. India's changed an enormous amount in the 40 years since then. And it was the first time I saw overpopulation and blatant poverty in a way that I just had never experienced it in either Europe or America. But just looking out the window of the bus as I was coming into Delhi for the first time, I realized all of these human problems could easily be solved. We have all the resources, all the intelligence, all the technology. It would be nothing to make this world a heaven on earth. But people don't want to. We're not motivated collectively to do that. And I realize that it's not a question of money or anything. It's a question of consciousness. People have to recognize their oneness with all of God's creatures, and then have a desire to serve and to love as God serves and loves. And I felt at that time, I mean, I had, as a teenager especially, I had a great longing to alleviate human suffering. And the human suffering that one sees most blatant is the suffering of poverty, physical poverty. I had no idea how to do that, and as I became more aware of the world, I realized how blocked all those potentials are because of consciousness. People don't have the consciousness. But when you begin to meditate, and when we begin to understand the true nature of God's creation, then what naturally awakens within us is a desire to serve. And we realize that our own joy comes not in the gaining and acquiring, but in the giving. And that's the salvation that Babaji and Jesus have planned by giving us an inner experience of the divine presence. Everything will gradually change. We are moving into a higher yuga. When we're moving into a higher yuga and consciousness is rising on this planet, it's practical to build, even though the society as a whole is not at all interested in the consciousness solutions that we are offering. The direction of society is toward that. And I've been in this movement now for like 50 years. More than that, somewhat more than that. And many things that were unthinkable when we started are now quite commonly accepted. So 50 years is a very short period of time. I know that a great many things that are still minority doesn't even begin to express it, just barely being noticed, but yet are inspired by the avatars, like our way of educating children, for example, or cooperative spiritual living, or small intentional communities. I know that those things too, probably in relatively short order, will gradually take hold. I heard a very intense talk that was given to me. It was sent by an advocate of vegetarianism, I think even of veganism, but especially of animal rights and the barbarism that's being carried out in order to provide human beings with the unnatural diet of excessive meat, especially red meat and so on. And he made the comment that there are so many vegetarians in the world that the vegetarians in the world equal a huge population. It's equal in population to, most of Europe, all of America, Canada, Mexico. There was this big name. If all vegetarians were actually a country, we'd be the biggest, most powerful country in the world. I thought that was just a very interesting way to say it. Now, of course, the Buddhist countries in Eastern India and many countries have been vegetarian for generations, for millennia. But now it's really coming into the Western world. All of that was unthinkable 50 years ago. And so what is unthinkable now will be common tomorrow. And that's, if we're going downward in the yuga cycles like we were when we incarnated with Christ, and I believe many of us did, Kali Yuga descended for another 5 centuries after Jesus died. So they didn't try to build anything. They just pulled back into desert caves and isolated monasteries because everything was falling to pieces in an external way. The teaching, the consciousness was preserved, but it only emerged gradually as Dwapara Yuga was rising. But in our time, we have to build in external ways, which is what we're doing. So, Swami ends the letter. Thank you for writing in Master. Now here's the next letter, which was actually written before the one I just read. Swami says, it would help me to be able to point to some specific teaching of Jesus where he himself, and not St. Paul, speaks of embracing the world in any sense. Oftentimes, a lot of what people attribute to Jesus is actually from the letters of St. Paul. So Swami wants to make a distinction there. Yes, I know he said, Jesus said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are of God. But in that statement, he didn't say what we give to Caesar or what we give to God, so that was insufficient. I know that Jesus mixed with publicans and the like, but I read that to mean he went wherever he saw love for God, regardless of religious or social position. I do not read it to mean that he was a man of the people in the sense one would normally understand the term. You know, that he was hardy and that he took on the simple pleasures of the common man, you know, and went to the pub to drink the beer or whatever it might be. You know, just he was one of the people, one of the guys. He said that's not what I think he meant. That he was indifferent to social position, financial position, religious affiliation. That's how Swami reads that. Master said he even went to Samaria. Quoting from the Bible, he must needs pass through Samaria because he knew there was a fallen disciple of his, who in fact was the woman of Samaria. He went to the dunghill, so to speak, of this world to find the few rare gems. Samaria did not have a very high reputation at that time. And this is the story where Jesus, he sent his disciples on an errand and sat alone by the well in Samaria, and a woman came to him there. Master explains that this was a disciple of Jesus from previous incarnation who had strayed from the path of righteousness, but now Jesus felt she had finished that karma and was ready to return to the fold. So he meets her there and he starts speaking with her. They're sitting by the well, they start talking about water. Gradually the conversation turns to more spiritual topics. Jesus and the woman senses that Jesus has some knowledge of spiritual topics and asks him a question or two, which Jesus answers. And then the woman asks Jesus to tell her more. Jesus says to her, yes, but before I do, bring your husband and I'll teach you together. And now Jesus knew exactly what he was doing in saying that. The woman replied, I have no husband. And Jesus said, yes, you're truthful in saying that. In fact, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you are living with is not your husband. Meaning you had 5 men in your life, which was not. She was obviously then a woman of low moral character. But what Jesus saw when she said that, as Master interprets it, was the woman was willing to tell Jesus the truth. That she was no longer hiding her mistakes from his eyes, and therefore he felt she was ready. And she was amazed. Now, when you read the story in the Bible with Master's interpretation, the logic of their conversation becomes more obvious, because so much seems to happen with so few words told. And the woman says, I'll go and bring the whole town, and I'll tell them that you knew everything about me, even though you just met me. And not much more is said in the Bible, but he stays and he teaches there for a while. But when his disciples return, they find him quite filled with the Spirit of God, because he's overjoyed to have found this lost sheep and brought her back into the fold. And he uses the phrase, I have meat to eat that ye know not of. And what he meant by that was, I am fed from the Spirit of God in ways that you don't know about. Because he sent the other disciples away because he didn't want to embarrass this fallen disciple. He didn't want her to see those who were close to him now and in some past life memory that she would still be carrying, to be ashamed of herself for having fallen away from the fold. So he protected her by meeting her alone, and then having her also be gone away when the other disciples came back. But he was so uplifted by it. And as Swami writes, the disciples didn't understand. And they thought maybe someone else had brought Jesus food. They just didn't know what to think about it. But what Swamiji is saying by using this example is that Jesus didn't hesitate to go wherever God called him. He didn't hold himself back from the suffering and the experience of people's lives. But as he said, that's quite different than saying that he himself participated like one of the boys. So now it would help me to find some passage where Jesus said something like, accept the world and your life in it for God's sake. After what you wrote, you must have such quotes, but I can't think of a one. So that was the first letter that Swami wrote. Then, before he got a response, he answered, everything I read says that Jesus is a renunciate. So now here's the third letter. And he says, neither Yogananda nor Jesus was austere. So this is written a few days later, so obviously his correspondent has sent him some convincing examples. So Swami writes, and this is again, here's Swamiji. He was arguing so strongly for his point of view, but now this man has given Swami something new to think about. In the context of your last letter, you've convinced me. So Swamiji wasn't stubborn. He just, this is what I think is true. Show me that it's not true. And so apparently this man persuaded him. In the context of your last letter, you've convinced me. In fact, what you describe of Jesus is very like Master himself. Not when I knew him, but when, as a young man, when he was a young man. He played the game more, not with human personality, for there was no ego there, but with divine joy, embracing God as everywhere. So Swamiji had often pointed out that he knew Master in the last 3.5 years of Master's life. That in 1948, in August of 1948, I believe, Master had a 3-day samadhi. He went into divine consciousness. He often went into cosmic consciousness, but he had a particular event that lasted 3 days in which continuously, seemingly day and night, he was in constant communion with Divine Mother, constant conversation with Divine Mother. And one of the characteristics that made this so unusual was that he spoke in her voice as well as in his own. In the book Trilogy of Divine Love, written by Durga Mata, I think that book is available. It might even be available from Crystal Clarity, I'm not sure. It's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, Durga Mata she met Master in the late 20s and lived with Master until the end of his life. She was a very close disciple. She writes about Master about his everyday life in a way that no one else writes about. And she was there when Master was much younger, and she was with him when he was that kind of a person. But that was less the point here. But in this samadhi in 1948, which Durga Mata describes in her book, the different disciples basically somebody was always with him as a stenographer, taking down the things he was saying and what he was experiencing, what he was telling them of what he was experiencing. And they say that Master was different after that. And among the things that Divine Mother said is, in the beginning, I sent you a few, I don't think she would use the word lemons, but a few difficult disciples. But now I am sending you only angels. And Swamiji was the first disciple to come after that samadhi. So, let me think what but they said Master was more withdrawn. And Master also knew from that experience that the end of his life was near. I asked Swamiji once, did you ever tease Master? Did you ever joke with him in that way? As we often did with Swami. He said, no, never, he said. I held him in much too much awe to be able to behave with him that way. But those who were young when Master was young, and they were all young together, he said they had a different relationship with him. And Master also became profoundly, differently, much more impersonal. Swamiji said after that samadhi, Master often talked about himself as being one with God. He talked about, he didn't, well, this is how Swami put it. When Master first came to America to introduce the Western world to this teaching, which was completely foreign to the Western way of thinking, Master had to make it seem as if he was just like everyone else, and that if he could realize God, we could all realize God. So he put out, Swami said, much more of an effort to seem just like everyone else. I mean, he traveled, he visited people in their homes, he played tennis, he was just more like everyone else. Just what Swami said, he played the game more. And at the end of his life, that was done. He just didn't do it. And that was the period when Swamiji knew him, when he was far more withdrawn from ordinary life than he was when Master himself was in his 20s and his 30s. Master was 27 when he came to America. So he was a very young man. And Dr. Lewis, his first disciple, was 27 when they met. So they were the same age, and they just grew up together. But by the time Swami met him, Master was almost 60 and was well established, and Swami was 22. So you can see the whole relationship was different. So Swami says, now the way, whatever was written here, that Swami's correspondent pointed out examples of how Jesus lived, Swami recognized in that the way Master lived before Swami knew him. Jesus, of course, the period of time that we know him, Jesus was from the age of 30 to the age of 33. Now, of course, people's lives were shorter at that time, but he was still a young man. He'd been 18 years of a ministry, of sadhana and ministry in India before he returned to Israel, to Palestine at that time, but still, he was still a young man. So, yes, I'm glad to read everything you've said. My own view was too austere, based on Master as I knew him, and on the many saints I have personally known. So Swami's just completely taking responsibility for learning something from his correspondent. I mean, among other things, you see, it shows Swami's understanding. Swami also commented about, in a totally different context, the question of what does it mean for a saint to be omniscient. Swami said Master often changed his mind when presented with new information that he wasn't aware of. So it's not like omniscience is every word that comes out of his mouth is just as soon as it comes out of his mouth, it's settled. There was an intelligent give and take. Oh, well, I didn't understand that this person had that responsibility. Very interestingly, in the book Conversations with Yogananda, conversation number 99, and the number is easy to remember, and in it, Master talks about the difficult position of being both omniscient and human. And what a sort of a balancing act Master has to do between keeping his mind on all aspects of things, and why the disciples have to help keep him informed. You can go look it up. It's fascinating to read. But Swami said, you know, it's naive to think, and he was talking about this in context of spiritual leadership of Ananda or of other spiritual organizations. He said even the Pope is not infallible all the time. It's only in certain points of dogma, when he makes a declaration, that it's considered to be the true statement of what the teaching means. It's not every single thing he says. Swami would shift his point of view when new information was brought to him. And that was the example that Master set. So new information was brought to him from a different angle. Swami realized he was making a mistake. In fact, in my chapters on the avatar in the book Hindu Way of Awakening, I state how an avatar has no need to be so austere. And Master wasn't. Not, I now realize, was Jesus. Thank you. Very interesting. Swami said that Master's realization was so complete and had been attained so long ago that Master just swam in the ocean of the world without any of it ever touching him. Whereas other great saints held themselves aloof. Ramana Maharshi is a very good example. Ramana Maharshi was extremely austere. He was a great soul, a Jivan Mukta undoubtedly. More advanced than that, I don't know, but he was a great soul, but he was austere. He held himself aloof from the world. Master himself explained that that Master didn't need to. Now, Ramana Maharshi could have been setting an example, but Swami interpreted it differently. That there was still a little necessity to hold himself back from this world, whereas Master was completely untouched by it, because Master was an avatar. I don't think even Ramana Maharshi's most devoted disciples claim that he was an avatar. But he was an example. He wore a little loincloth. He lived very simply. He never left his ashram grounds. It was just, his life was very different than Master's was. Okay, so now there's one more letter, and it's a long one, in this Christianity section. I don't know if we'll finish it or not. The summary says, Swami was asked about certain conflicts with traditional Christian dogma in Swami's book of commentary on the New Testament, The Promise of Immortality. The Promise of Immortality follows the same map, same outline, as the Sunday service readings that we do. It's 26 weeks of the comparison, Swami wrote short comparisons between Bible and Gita verses to show them as similar teachings. The Promise of Immortality is the first 26 weeks of those commentaries, much expanded. Swami often spoke of writing the second half of that book. The one he wrote put more emphasis and explanation on the Bible verses. Then Swami talked about writing the second half, putting more emphasis on the Gita verses. But in between, he wrote the whole Gita commentary. So he never finished. But still, you wouldn't know it wasn't finished. But so somebody who read that book says that it's inconsistent with Christian theology. And Swami is answering that. This letter was written in 2002, which is 4 years after the other letters. Swami said, the reason I've not tried to answer your questions is that they demand long answers, and one feels challenged to answer such questions when they are close to the surface in one's own experience and memory. For instance, questions on reincarnation would have been more fun to answer 50 years ago, shortly after I'd done my own wrestling with the issue. Questions on the Eucharist would have been interesting for me when I was studying Catholic history and theology, again, 40 to 50 years ago. That's why I've encouraged our churches to give the newer members the job of answering newcomers' questions. After a time, these matters become so settled in one's mind, in one's own mind, that one just doesn't feel like entering the waters yet again. They become no longer meaningful. Yet, I've had all those questions myself. It isn't that I wonder at your bringing them up. Isn't that a sweet way for Swami to explain it all? That is a suggestion that Swami often made at our guest facilities and so on, that you should have newcomers, you should have relatively new members of Ananda talking to those who are newer still, because they have more in common, you know. And I actually fully appreciate what he's saying. So perhaps this person had sent these letters to Swami and he hasn't been answering. So he says, I wrote you some months ago that I felt sad over your difficulties. The sadness was based on the fact that for so many years, I've tried to build bridges between the teachings of India and those propounded in Christianity. And I've been forced to admit that my efforts were unsuccessful. I'd hoped to bring meditation to the churches. I even started a movement which I called the movement of inner communion. I used to go to the churches with devotion. I attended Mass. This all happened in the 80s primarily, a little bit into the 90s, but mostly in the 80s, when Swami was just beginning our work in Italy. He was married at the time to an Italian woman. She was part of a charismatic Catholic group, and which was involved with the Catholic Church in the town of Sorrento where they lived. The local priest was part of their group. The whole group became interested in autobiography of a yogi. Eventually they all studied with Swamiji, all took Kriya Yoga and began to start practicing Kriya Yoga, all in the context of being devout Catholics and participating in Mass and being responsible for the spiritual well-being of their church, guided by their priest. It was also during that time, which would have been 1984-85, Swami went with Rosanna to Israel, and he wrote the oratorio, Christ Lives in the Holy Land and in You. That's what it was called. And it was an expression in music of the vibration of the teachings of Christ in tune with the practice of self-realization. That was a rather long explanation, but that's really what it was. It was very interesting in the development of Ananda. Jesus had always been on our altar, in the center of the altar. Our prayer was always to Jesus. But for the most part, for those first 10 or 15 years, Ananda was much more oriented toward the India side of what we were doing, Babaji and Master. And Jesus was there, and we celebrated Christmas and we celebrated Easter, but for most of us, it was never really quite clear how to do that. After Swami went on that pilgrimage to Israel and wrote that music, through the music, an understanding of the integration of self-realization and Jesus as one of our avatars, one of our gurus, somehow the right consciousness was created from that. And Swami's hope was that that oratorio could be performed in Christian churches and the same transformation would be communicated, that they would understand from the inside what Jesus was doing. Outer communion as a ritual was well understood, so Swami called it the movement of inner communion. And his hope had been that through the charismatic Catholic group, who were also Kriyabans, that would be the core of how that message could extend out into the church. And Swami was extremely intent on doing this. And in America, he set up a whole department of Ananda that had the sole responsibility of carrying this recorded version of the oratorio that also was illustrated with slides of the pilgrimage places that the songs represented, of traveling all over the U.S. and putting forth this program. It was like a multimedia, so it didn't require a whole choir. We did it live also, but this was a technologically recorded version, advanced for the time, primitive for now, but advanced for the time. So just a person with the right machines could present it by themselves. And we put that oratorio on. I don't know if it was into the hundreds, but it was many, many dozens of churches. And Swami was just hoping to get this sort of interest going in a deeper understanding of Jesus' teaching. It totally failed. People enjoyed the oratorio, tiny bit of interest got going on a bigger sense, and so he says, I was forced in the end, alas, to accept that it just wouldn't work, this movement of inner communion. The people I was able to reach were not those devoted to the churches, however sincere they were in their own Christianity. They were those who had, like myself, left the churches in disillusionment. So he'd hoped to inspire the clergy, to inspire the priests, to inspire within a church a great movement, so there would be this sort of groundswell of enthusiasm that would bring them to meditation and to a deeper understanding, all without leaving the context of the church, but just to give it a deeper reality. This is exactly what Swami was inspired to write in the Festival of Light. High in the Himalayas, Jesus appeared to the great Master Babaji. The lights on the high altar of my church, Jesus said, are growing dim. Though still lit on lower altars of good works, the noble taper of inner communion with the Lord burns low and is ill attended. Let us together, united in Christ's love, set lights ablaze on that high altar once again. Thus a new ray of light was sent to earth through the great masters of our path. So this is exactly what Swami was trying to do, to carry out this commission, this request of Jesus to reignite this deeper teaching in the churches. I was forced in the end, alas, to accept that it just wouldn't work. He did reach those who were devoted to Jesus, but it was not those in the churches. It was those who had walked away like himself in disillusionment. Too bad, for the teachings are the same. Yogis teach the same practices that were taught long ago in Christianity itself. This is Master's statement, that Jesus taught his disciples Kriya Yoga or something very much like it. There's a lot in the Bible on reincarnation, Swami says. I've mentioned some of this material in the path in the chapter on reincarnation. There's a great deal in the path about Jesus and about the true teachings of Christianity. Actually, also in Autobiography of a Yogi, but especially in the path. And that chapter called Reincarnation in the New Path is filled with quotes from the Bible. These truths don't exist merely on a theoretical level. Lots of reputable people have remembered having lived before and have demonstrated the accuracy of their memory. So Swami is trying to answer a little bit this person's question about reincarnation. A few quotes one of the most telling quotes in the Bible. Wait, let me just give it a moment here. It is a fairly widely accepted fact of church history now that a few hundred years after Jesus, there was a deliberate effort on the part of the church to remove from the Bible all references to reincarnation. But reincarnation was an accepted truth of Judaism at the time that Jesus lived. Now, these arguments are made in other places, filled out in other places. But a few references to reincarnation were not. And the reason they wanted to is that the church wanted to have more influence and control over the behavior of their members. And if you thought you weren't going to go to hell, you were just going to get another chance to get it right, that is not nearly as compelling a reason to do what the church is telling you to do. The threat of eternal damnation held people to the Catholic Church in great fear. To be excommunicated from the church was to be condemned to an eternity of suffering in hell. That's a pretty big stick to hold over people's head. And if you broke any of the tenets of the church, or the commandments of the church, misbehaved in countless ways, you risked eternal damnation. It held people not by inspiration, but by total fear. It's terrible, but it was very effective. And it held for many centuries until Dwapara Yuga, rising consciousness, caused people to realize that there was something amiss about this teaching. As Swami says, you have a finite action and you have an eternal result. Plus, it's such an ugly picture of God that he would actually condemn his children to eternal suffering. It's just an awful teaching. But it held for a long, long time. So reincarnation undermined that, because what is the punishment? Yes, you can threaten that you'll have terrible lifetimes, but reincarnation also gives you all the time in the world to learn. And so the present priest who's trying to have authority over you, you're taking away a lot of his capacity to demand from you. So institutional imperatives cause people to reason things out in other ways, and thus revelation becomes a religion. And the avatar brings a revelation. Over time, people turn it into a religion, which is why in India, they understand that the avatars have to keep returning, which is why Jesus came to restore what Jesus taught. Master came to restore what Jesus taught and what Krishna taught, because both have been overlaid with religion. And he wanted to bring it back to the simplicity of the revelation. So, but in the Bible, one of the most telling remnants that was left in about reincarnation, Jesus says to his disciples, "Who do you think I am?" And they name prophets who have lived before. That you are Elijah, or you are Elisha, or you are this prophet or that prophet. And Elijah was supposed to come before the avatar. And Jesus didn't correct them. That was just, who am I? So they name great saints who have lived before Jesus, meaning that you are the return. And then, are you the Messiah? But Elijah had to come before the Messiah would be born. And so that was kind of a problem, like how, Elijah promised to come, then the Messiah would come. This is the tradition of the Jewish people that Jesus came to fulfill. And they say, but Elijah hasn't come, so how can you be the Messiah? Jesus says, no, Elijah has come. You just didn't know, you didn't recognize him. And the Bible says the disciples knew that Jesus was speaking of John the Baptist. So Elijah was a man, a prophet who'd lived in the past. He's reincarnated as John the Baptist, and that's just the conversation they're having. And nobody's, completely shocked by it, because that's what Jesus taught. And there are other references, but that's just that's just a few. So Swami's saying is that lots of reputable people, if this isn't just theoretical, lots of reputable people remember their past lives and demonstrate the accuracy of their memory. And he refers to one book, a fascinating book on the subject is a book called I Have Lived Before, The True Story of the Reincarnation of Shanti Devi by a man named Sture Lonenstrand. In that book, let's see, she was, it's an extremely interesting book. She's a child. She's very upset because the house she's living in is not her house. These are not really her parents. And gradually over time, she tells them who her real parents are and where she really lived. And they go back to the village, wherever it was in India, because at least they had a context there to believe her. And she demonstrated, remarkable knowledge of the situation, of the people. She even knew where money was hidden that no one could find after she died. She went and found the money and gave the people the money and various other things. I don't remember all the details, but it was just astonishing. And there was really no explanation except the one that she gave, which was that she had been that person then and she was this person now. I don't think it's that story, but there's another reincarnation story where the man comes back and he'd been murdered. And he pointed out the man who'd murdered him. He explained how he'd been killed, and he led people to the grave where his body, where this man had hidden his body. And I mean, all of it was verifiably true, that the man had disappeared. Nobody knew what happened to him. These are just, there's countless stories like this. We all know it. There's a modern one that happened after this of a little boy in America, actually, who, maybe not in America, he might have been in Europe, but I'm not sure. No, I think he was American. And he used to have nightmares of being burned to death. And then he would draw, as a little child, he would draw all these pictures of airplanes crashing and so on. And as he got old enough to speak, he was a young man in his early 20s. He'd been a pilot during World War II. And his plane had been shot down, and he'd gone down in flames into the ocean. And gradually his parents, who absolutely did not believe in reincarnation, I think they were devout Christians actually, and this little boy just kept insisting, and he kept adding more and more truth to that, and he needed, because he was traumatized, he needed to work through this. And finally he knew what his name was. And he was born soon enough after the war. They were able to find his sister, who was an old woman who was still living. He recognized her. He knew many, many things about the family, about the house, about photographs, just all this sort of thing. And finally, there was a reunion of his squadron, of those who were left. And he met them, and he recognized, through their voices, he recognized who they were. He called them by their names. But Swami was always fond of commenting that when his parents took him to that reunion, he looked at all these men, and they were now old men. And of course, he had known them when they were young. And he just looked at his mother with great dismay. "Mommy, they're so old." Because he thought he was going to go back to the point it was when he had left them. But in the end, of course, his parents became absolutely convinced. And he finally expiated the whole thing. They went out on the ocean. They went to the spot where his plane went down. They had a ceremony there, and it was extremely emotionally traumatic for the boy. But he eventually was able to get through it. You could see that the trauma of his death had just frozen him in that period and kept all those memories so vivid. And also, it's the time now for these things to be verified and made universal, because we're in a rising age. But he eventually was able, as a boy, with his parents' help, to finish that incarnation and put it behind him. Fascinating. I mean, in a practical sense, I've had one very vivid dream about past lives, and I've had many intuitions which I believe to be true. But once it becomes, as Swami says, just once you integrate it, it makes everything so much richer and more sensible. You know, instant affinities, instant aversions, inclinations to visit unusual places. A friend of mine here, she travels entirely according to intuition. She'll just hear about a place, you know, some island on the other side of the world, some oriental city, you know, some mountaintop, and she'll just feel that this is a place that resonates with her, and she'll go and just experience all these different places and cultures, and she's quite certain, and I think she's right, she's just finishing up, revisiting, re-enjoying realities she's had before. I know when I was in Athens and went up to the Acropolis, it's ruins now, but to me it was, I felt so much joy on that hilltop. It just felt like a place that I'd been, and I'd been very, very happy there. It was very hard to get me off that hilltop. I was very reluctant to leave. Fanciful, perhaps, but I don't think so. So anyway, so now Swami says, as for the Eucharist, there's nothing wrong with it as a dogma, meaning drink the wine and have it, eat the bread and drink the wine. Do this in remembrance of me, Jesus said. And the wine represents the blood of Christ, and the bread represents the body. Master explained it that the blood is the all-flowing life force of Christ consciousness, and the bread is the body, which is the Om vibration, and that these are states of consciousness that Jesus expressed, not actually physiological remembrances. I'm perfectly aware, and the dogma of it is that in the ritual, the plain wafer becomes, how did they say that? It becomes transformed into the actual reality of Jesus. It contains his consciousness. So as a dogma, that the ritual can become the actual experience, I think that's the dogma he means. I'm perfectly aware of Therese Neumann's experiences and don't in any way challenge them. Now her experiences are this. You know, the wafers that are used in the Catholic ritual, some people do it in a more homey way with just loaves of bread, but in the Catholic Church there's the wafer, and it's just a wafer. It's just flour and water baked, and it is just a cracker in a sense, until the priest consecrates it. And when it becomes a consecrated wafer, then it represents the reality of Jesus, and it becomes holy and sacred at that point. And the consecrated wafers are kept in a particular, there's a word for it which I can't remember, and it's completely different than the unconsecrated wafers, and they're a holy thing, and they're deeply respected. In one of the towns in Italy, there was a tremendous scandal when holy consecrated wafers were stolen, and the whole town prayed to have them returned, because it was a terror, a blasphemy, to have consecrated wafers just taken away from the holy receptacle where they were kept. Now, Therese Neumann didn't eat. She didn't eat or drink any food for years and years, for decades. It was a well-substantiated, miraculous reality. She lived by cosmic energy. She did not live by food. But she would take the communion wafer. The communion wafer was the only thing that she could eat. But if it was an unconsecrated wafer, she would spit it out, because she knew immediately. And that's How do you put that together? And they experimented and tried to trick her and just tried to see. It's exactly the same way for her. But if it was unconsecrated, she was incapable of swallowing it and she had to spit it out. If it was consecrated, it would dissolve and she could take it in. That's why Swami says, as a dogma, there it is. I don't in any way challenge them. The same sort of points could be made regarding many other religious experiences in other religions. I too have been greatly inspired by church services. And there's a church in Siena, Italy, where the wafer itself is held to be particularly sacred. I've had wonderful meditations there. So Swami doesn't dispute many of the basic tenets of Christianity. And then he says, it's the exclusivity of Christian dogma that I reject. When I was talking to a devout Christian priest, actually, who was also a Kriyaban, he said that, all the dogmas are perfectly true from a certain angle. He said, you just have to put aside, well, he said, the only Son of God. Now that, when traditional Christians say that, they mean Jesus. They don't mean Christ consciousness, which is what Jesus himself meant, which was the sole manifestation of God in the world, is the Christ consciousness. That's when God purely expresses. And because Jesus lived in that state, he was the true Son of God, but it wasn't the body Jesus. Jesus himself made a distinction between his consciousness and his body. His body he called the Son of Man, his consciousness he called the Son of God. So the only Son of God means the only body, the only physically incarnated being that has ever had God consciousness. Swamiji says, it's the exclusivity of Christianity that I reject. So Swami says, well, I thought to go further into these matters, but honestly, my heart simply isn't in it. I no longer try to convince those who have been conditioned to believe otherwise. That's an interesting phrase. I no longer try to persuade those who have been conditioned to believe otherwise. This is, I've been working in another series of broadcasts about the Ananda way of life, following the guidelines for members of the Ananda Sevaka monastic order. And one of the paragraphs in that book says, Ananda members should not continue unthinkingly in the habitual way. Let's see, I happen to have the book right here, so I will find it and say it exactly accurately. Just give me a moment. Ananda members should sift mentally through their personal habits and not continue unthinkingly in old patterns of behavior merely because of some prior momentum that has been established in their lives. In this case, he's talking about behavior, but it also applies to thought. We should not continue unthinkingly just because there's momentum for that. So this is the phrase that Swami uses. I no longer try to convince those who have been conditioned to believe otherwise. So it's very important on the spiritual path to make conscious decisions. One of the influences that Swami Kriyananda had on us was he just didn't let us continue in an habitual way. If you just spouted something as if it were true because that's the way you were raised or that's the way you always thought it was, he wasn't harsh, but he would reflect back that a more conscious approach to life might be necessary. But you can't really, you have to argue people out of it. It's just not worth it. Swami never argued. If people genuinely wanted to know, he would give them good answers to their sincere questions. But if they really just wanted him to fight with them and prove that they were wrong, he just would never do that. He just wouldn't. So that's what he's saying here. And Swami thought he would get into it more, but he just doesn't have a heart for it. That's why I was sad. I didn't see what I could do to bridge these matters for you. So that must have been a reference, he said. It makes me sad to hear you talk like this. Because Swami was hoping that he would be able to make that bridge. That's what Swami said. I wanted to make this bridge. I was writing the promise of immortality for another audience and would have liked so much for you to feel a rapport with what I was saying. But I'm simply forced by the facts to accept that Master's teachings won't reach everyone. So apparently this person just rejected that book, and Swami had specifically hoped that it would persuade them. Swamiji himself said, I know it's naive, but I like to think that everyone will accept Master's teachings if I just explain it well enough. And he said, it helps me to think that because it inspires me to keep trying. So Swami must have had this person somewhat in mind when he wrote this book, hoping that this would be the book that would bridge the gap. But apparently not, and that made Swami sad, because he knew that this correspondent would be happier if he could see a bigger picture. I am convinced, however, that we will reach increasing numbers of people who have grown up with new ideas and a new outlook. And that's part of the reason why things are changing, because the souls that are being born have different karma, and they are being born into a globalized world in which cultures are all mixed up with each other, in which the unitive view of life is so widely accepted that it just seems natural to them, and they grow up in multicultural environments, and it just seems silly to sort of think that I was born into is that different or superior, when my own experience tells me that human beings are the same everywhere. In saying this, I don't at all mean to be slighting, but I don't see how to build the bridge you want. Or at least I have to say the job isn't mine to address. No doubt someone will do it someday. Every attempt so far to do so, however, that I've heard or read has been, in my opinion, merely a 1 horsepower kind of energy. If it finally convinced anyone, it left hearts dry, not inspired. I'd like so much to be of greater help. So I think what I'm hearing in this last paragraph is that somebody read Promise of Immortality and was disappointed in it, and wrote to Swamiji and wanted him to make the book different, and, if you just make these arguments or that arguments. Swami says, I don't think so. I've done what I could. I had hope for it. I have to accept it's not going to happen. Swamiji, when he was trying to make the movement of inner communion happen, when it finally was clear that it simply wasn't going to, he sort of said something like, well, I didn't think it would really succeed, but I felt we at least had to try. Which he did. He felt we had to try. But after that effort, he began to feel, well, as he says it here, it's just not mine to do. Perhaps someone at some point will find a way to bridge the dogmas of Christianity with the teachings of Sanatana Dharma. But Swami said, I've done everything I can, and now I leave it to others to do. So, and also in this book, we have done all that we need to do, and we have moved now out of yoga and Christianity, and the next chapter is all about self-realization fellowship. And we had a long dispute with that organization that took us through many years of philosophy and even legal struggle. I'm going to read through, and we might not go through every letter because there's lots of pages and I'm not sure it's all relevant. So we'll see, but we'll at least do some of it. So my friends, God bless you.